What will happen when a young ranger risks his life to save a wild lynx, only for her to return years later in the most unexpected way? This story isn't just about danger, but about trust, loyalty, and something almost magical. You won't believe how it ends. The story begins with a man named Edward, who always loved animals. Since he was a boy, he watched his father work as a farm ranger. Edward looked up to him and dreamed of doing the same, spending his life in nature, protecting wildlife. Now grown up, Edward had finally become a ranger. He got a job in a beautiful national park, surrounded by tall trees, rivers, and wild animals. He had waited months for this chance. He thought his days would be full of adventure, walking in the forest, helping animals, and living his dream. But his first week was the opposite. Instead of being out in nature, he was stuck inside, cleaning gear, organizing files, and making coffee. The older rangers were kind, but didn't take him seriously. They treated him like a beginner. Still, Edward didn't complain. He stayed hopeful and worked hard. Then, one cold afternoon, everything changed. His real test finally came. Edward's senior told him that the trail cameras near the cliffs had stopped working. It meant driving far into the park and camping overnight in the freezing cold, and nobody wanted to go. The team looked around, already knowing who'd be sent. But Edward saw this as a chance to learn, and he didn't wait for orders. With a big smile, he grabbed his gear. This was finally a real mission. He took an off-road vehicle because it was getting late, and the path was too rough for a horse. Edward reached the cliffs just before dark and found the problem right away. A large cable had been chewed through, likely by a rodent. After fixing it, he took a moment to enjoy the view and set up camp. The wind was harsh, and despite his thick layers, he still couldn't get warm. But he didn't mind. He felt more alive than ever. The next morning, Edward packed up early, ready to head back since his job was done. But then his radio buzzed. 2 hikers had gone missing near the cliffs, and Edward was the closest ranger. They asked him to check the area. He searched everywhere, across hills, trails, and even the cliffs, but he couldn't find any trace of the hikers. Just as he was about to leave, another message came through. The hikers had been found safe. He could return now. But then something caught his attention. A lynx stood near the cliff's edge. Edward froze. With trembling hands, he grabbed his binoculars, and his heart sank. The lynx wasn't just standing there, she was stuck. Her leg was badly caught, and she could barely move. Edward immediately radioed for help, but it would take hours to get there. The lynx didn't have that long. "Stay away from the cliffs," the team warned. But Edward couldn't walk away. He knew that if he waited for backup, the lynx might end up in even more danger. Ignoring the warning, he tied a rope to a nearby tree and began climbing down. The lynx stayed still, not moving. But just as Edward got close, disaster struck. The rope slid against a sharp rock and snapped. Now, Edward was hanging from the cliff with just his fingers. His hands were freezing and his body trembled. For a brief moment, it felt like this might be the end. But then, something inside him took over. Maybe it was fear, or the thought of saving the lynx. But he couldn't stop. He forced himself to climb. Slowly, inch by inch, he pulled himself up to a narrow ledge. When he reached the ledge, what he saw shocked him. The area where the lynx was trapped was wide enough to walk on. There was even a small trail leading straight to it. He didn't need to climb. But now that he was here, he focused on saving her. The lynx didn't try to attack. She just looked at Edward, quiet and calm. Her leg was stuck deep in a hole and twisted in a painful way. Edward slowly dug around it with his hands, clearing the dirt bit by bit. The lynx flinched a little but didn't fight him. Carefully, he took off his jacket, wrapped her gently, and lifted her in his arms. The walk back to the vehicle was freezing. Edward's arms hurt from the weight, but the lynx stayed quiet the whole time. Once he reached the vehicle, he used his radio to call the vet and told them he was bringing an injured animal. When he arrived at the clinic, the other rangers stared at him in shock. "You brought her here?" one of them whispered. "You could have died." But Edward didn't care. He just wanted her to live. The vet checked the lynx and returned with surprising news. "She's pregnant," she said. At first it felt strange, but the lynx slowly got used to Edward. She started eating the food he gave and rested quietly in the warm cabin. A few days later, something amazing happened. She gave birth to 3 tiny kittens. Edward was there the whole time. He was the only one the lynx trusted. She let him near her and her babies because she knew he meant no harm. While the mother recovered from her surgery, Edward took care of the kittens. Every 2 hours, he fed them with small bottles. He barely got any sleep, but he didn't complain. When the vet finally said it was safe, Edward placed the kittens beside their mother. She licked them gently and purred. It was a moment he would remember forever. Soon, the lynx got stronger. When the time came to let them go, Edward took them back to the cliffs. He opened the carrier. The lynx jumped out with her kittens. Just before she disappeared into the forest, she looked back at Edward. He smiled, not knowing how special that moment truly was. Years passed, and Edward was no longer the new guy. He had become one of the best rangers in the park, known for his kindness, bravery, and love for animals. He still liked going on long hikes alone and handling tough tasks by himself. So when it rained heavily for several days, Edward offered to check the river trails. The water was rising, but things looked fine at first. Then, the ground beneath him shook. A loud rumble echoed through the valley. Edward turned and saw a wall of mud racing toward him, a mudslide. He ran, but it came too fast. He grabbed a tree and held on tightly. The mud slammed into him, knocking the wind out of his lungs. It pulled him down and buried him halfway. He was stuck. Mud pressed on his chest, and sharp branches scraped his body. Pain shot through him. He couldn't move. He hoped someone had seen him. Maybe a camera caught it. Maybe another ranger nearby. He didn't know that help was already coming, but not from someone he expected. From a distance, a pair of eyes watched carefully. It was her, the same lynx Edward had once saved. She stood quietly at the edge of the mudslide, letting out soft calls. Edward looked up and saw her. He could hardly believe it. She looked older now, but her eyes were just the same. Then, without a sound, she turned and disappeared. Edward thought she had left. His last friend, gone, but she hadn't. The lynx ran through the trees, fast and focused. She didn't stop until she reached a group of rangers. One of them noticed her right away. That limp in her walk and the old scar on her leg, they remembered her. She paced back and forth in front of them, then looked back toward the forest. She wanted them to follow. And they did. She led them all the way to the muddy slope, right to the place where Edward was trapped. The rangers got to work fast. When Edward heard voices calling his name, he knew he had a chance. They pulled him out and called for a helicopter. The lynx stayed close, watching from a safe spot, her eyes locked on him. Edward was hurt. His shoulder was out of place, his arm was broken, and he had cracked ribs. But he was alive, because she came back for him. The lynx he once carried through snow had saved his life. Months later, Edward returned to work, and sometimes, when walking near the cliffs or deep into the woods, he'd stop. He'd look around, quietly hoping to see her again. Because in the wild, where nature can be harsh, something rare had happened. Kindness was returned, and it had saved a life.